Alcaraz and Juan Carlos Ferrero split up, and
we got two major splits within the sport. Tennis, man.
Ferrero finally exposes the one thing Alcaraz's father never wanted said out loud. The demand buried in that contract was so calculated, so deliberately cold, it didn't just end a partnership, it proved he never respected him as a person. 7 years of Grand Slams meant nothing when that contract arrived, because Ferrero had already mapped out the entire 2026 preseason before it landed on his desk. This week, Ferrero had to file an official statement correcting fabricated quotes the media invented about him. Before that, he publicly admitted he would coach Sinner, the rival built to dismantle everything Ferrero constructed. The coach Alcaraz's father discarded is rebuilding his career in full public view, while that same father has said nothing meaningful since December. 5 words to the entire tennis world. Everyone is free to give their opinion. That was it. That silence is not restraint, it is protection. Sources confirmed Alcaraz's father controlled every clause of that negotiation. Ferrero submitted one counteroffer, rejected cold without a single word exchanged. That proved something permanent and ugly. Subscribe right now. What follows makes this worse than anything reported so far. This is what Ferrero finally exposes, and it begins right now. The contract arrived on a Saturday, December 13, 2025. Ferrero received it, not through a phone call, not through a conversation, not through the kind of face-to-face exchange you would expect between two people who had spent 7 years building something together. He received a document from a legal team with a Monday morning deadline attached to it. Sit with that for a moment. This was not a man who had been casually involved in Alcaraz's career. This was the architect of it. Under Ferrero's coaching, Alcaraz became the youngest world number 1 in the Open era, achieving in his teens what most players spend a lifetime chasing. He won 6 Grand Slam titles. He won 24 ATP Tour titles in total. He was competing in finals at tournaments that historically belonged to fully developed 30-year-old professionals. And when the 2025 season ended, when Alcaraz had just reached the ATP Finals final in Turin, Ferrero was already working. He had mapped out the entire 2026 preseason. He had planned the Australian Open schedule in detail. His assumption, reasonable, earned, and apparently shared by everyone in the immediate camp at that point, was that they were continuing. That is what makes the Saturday contract so significant. It was not delivered to a man who was idle, drifting, or causing problems. It was delivered to a man who was actively working toward the next chapter. He had not been told there was a problem. He had not been warned that terms needed to change. He had not been given any indication that the relationship was under pressure. According to Ferrero himself, speaking to Spanish sports newspaper Marca in late December, everything seemed like it was set to continue. When you read that sentence, the contract's 48-hour deadline stops being a procedural inconvenience and becomes something considerably darker. Ferrero reviewed the terms. He found conditions that conflicted with his values, conditions he described publicly as non-sporting clauses. He did not specify what those clauses were, and he has consistently declined to do so across every interview he has given since the split. What he did say is that the financial issue was not the problem. He was not arguing about money. He was arguing about something structural, about what the contract said about his role, his autonomy, and his standing within the operation. In a later interview, Ferrero reflected that in his previous contract, there weren't many clauses in my favor. The new offer, rather than addressing that imbalance, apparently moved further in the opposite direction. He submitted a counteroffer. That counteroffer was rejected. At no point was there a meeting. At no point was there a phone call that attempted to find a middle ground. At no point did the person driving the negotiation on the other side sit across a table from Ferrero and discuss the terms as one professional to another. Ferrero acknowledged this directly. Perhaps they could have been resolved if we had sat down to talk, but we didn't, and we decided not to continue. That statement carries enormous weight. He is describing a 7-year partnership being dissolved by paperwork. He is describing a deadline, not a dialogue. Now the question that matters, who was driving? The answer has been consistent across every credible source that has addressed this story. A source described as very close to the years of success, Alcaraz and Ferrero shared together, told journalists that there were significant disagreements between Ferrero and Alcaraz's father about how to manage the player's career. That friction was not new. It had been building across multiple seasons, accumulating through specific incidents that each, individually, might have seemed manageable, but collectively told a story about a relationship where two philosophies were pulling in opposite directions. As far back as early 2023, there was a reported confrontation between Ferrero and Alcaraz's father regarding Ferrero's decision to miss certain tour dates during Alcaraz's recovery from injury. Alcaraz's father believed Ferrero should have been present throughout his son's comeback. Ferrero had his own commitments and his own judgment about where his presence was most necessary. That disagreement, reported by Clay, was a signal. It was the kind of signal that gets filed away rather than resolved, and filed away signals compound. Then came a moment after the 2024 US Open. Alcaraz exited the tournament earlier than expected, and shortly afterward traveled to a Formula One event. Ferrero was reportedly opposed to it. His position on these matters was always the same. Commitment to the game demanded discipline off it. Holidays in Ibiza, events in Monaco, media appearances that pulled focus. These were the things Ferrero resisted, consistently and sometimes vocally. His instinct was always to protect the athlete from the weight of his own commercial attractiveness. In an ATP interview, he described his role clearly. "I was the guy who says no to many things." The Netflix documentary released in 2025, Carlos Alcaraz, My Way, complicated that dynamic. In it, Ferrero questioned whether a player who prioritized enjoyment could sustain greatness at the elite level over time. For a family watching their son be publicly questioned by his own coach, even in the context of a broadly celebratory documentary, the reaction was reportedly one of significant displeasure. Samuel Lopez joined the team partway through 2025, ostensibly as a second coach. Sources with knowledge of the internal dynamics were clear about what that addition actually represented. Lopez was more lenient. The family was, reportedly, delighted with him. By the time December arrived, the architecture of what would happen next had already been constructed over years. The contract was not a decision made in a weekend. It was the delivery mechanism for a decision that had been building since at least 2023, and one that, according to Spanish journalist José Moran, a reporter with sourced access to the camp's internal dynamics, had been intended to happen a full year earlier. After the 2024 season, Alcaraz's circle had already moved to make this change. They had approached Andy Murray. Murray was prepared to step in. The reason it did not happen then is not complicated. Alcaraz himself stopped it. The player who called Ferrero his second father went to his own camp and said no. 1 year later, he did not say no again. When the story broke publicly in December and the tennis world began processing what had happened, Carlos Alcaraz Sr. made a brief statement to Spanish news agency EF. 5 words. "Everyone is free to give their opinion." That was the entirety of his public contribution to a conversation that involved his son's 7-year professional partnership being dissolved on a Monday morning deadline. He offered no explanation of the contract terms. He offered no account of why there was no negotiating conversation. He offered no acknowledgement of what Ferrero had built for his son. 5 words, and then silence. Jan Wertheim of Sports Illustrated, who spoke to sources familiar with the situation, framed one of the central tensions clearly. The disagreement involved commercial opportunities and how much of Alcaraz's energy should be directed toward endorsements and appearances versus toward the singular focus of training and competing. Ferrero's position on that question had always been clear. He was not willing to compromise it. Carlos Santos, Alcaraz's first childhood coach, was among the voices who spoke most plainly about what the split actually represented. Carlos's father is the one who's really in charge. Carlitos has nothing to do with it. I mean, Carlitos would have continued for as long as Juan Carlos wanted. That is an extraordinary statement about the internal power structure of the operation surrounding one of the best players in the world. It describes a situation where the person most directly involved, the athlete whose career was at stake, whose relationship with Ferrero was genuine and deep, was not the one making the decision. 3 months after the split, Ferrero appeared on El Cafelito, the Spanish video podcast hosted by journalist Josep Pedrerol, and delivered his most complete public accounting of the situation. He described the nature of their working arrangement, annual contracts that renewed automatically unless actively renegotiated. He confirmed that both sides entered active negotiation for 2026 and reached a position they could not move beyond. He said, "I asked for certain conditions, and on their part, others were asked for, and there has been no understanding." He acknowledged the role of family and environment with careful but direct language. Family and the environment may have influenced it, yes. He did not name the father specifically. He has never named the father specifically. What he did say, and it is the line that spread through every tennis media outlet immediately, was this: "Deep down in my heart, I couldn't say no to Alcaraz." Read that carefully. You do not describe your inability to refuse someone who left you if you were the one who chose to leave. That sentence, from a man who has been scrupulously measured across every interview since December, is the clearest confirmation available that the decision was made elsewhere, that it was brought to Ferrero as a conclusion, not as a conversation. Then came the moment in Melbourne. Alcaraz won the Australian Open, his 7th Grand Slam title, the one that completed the career slam. The title that, in any ordinary account of how these things work, would have included a mention of the man who spent 7 years helping to build him into a player capable of winning it. Alcaraz did not mention Ferrero in his victory speech. Ferrero was asked about it in subsequent interviews. His response was measured, careful, and, between the lines, quietly devastating. "It didn't bother me that he didn't mention me. Obviously, if he had, I'd have liked it. But I assume he and his team have decided not to talk about the matter anymore, and that's that." He and his team. That phrase, not Carlos, not Carlitos. The team that decides. Alcaraz himself, in press conferences following the Australian Open, described the split as a mutual decision and said no choice was made without discussion. He acknowledged having experienced certain doubts after reading the public reaction to the announcement. The wave of support for Ferrero, the criticism directed at his circle, the widespread sense that something had been handled badly. He then said, "We saw that we needed a change." That word, "we," is doing a great deal of work in that sentence. It absorbs a father, a legal team, a decision taken across 2 days, and a counteroffer rejected without a single conversation. Tony Nadal, as he tends to do, cut through the diplomatic packaging with characteristic directness. "I understand that nothing is done without Carlos's approval, of course. That is almost certainly true. Alcaraz is not a passive figure in his own life. He is an adult, a 6-time Grand Slam champion, a man of enormous competitive intelligence. But there is a meaningful difference between approving a decision and making one. There is a difference between being presented with the outcome of a negotiation and being the person who drove it. The question of whether Alcaraz truly wanted this, or whether he was carried along by a current his camp had been building for 2 years, may never be fully answered. What is answerable is this: Ferrero received a contract on a Saturday with a Monday deadline that contained terms he found incompatible with his professional values. He submitted a counteroffer. It was rejected without discussion. He was not given the chance to sit across a table from the people making the decision. A 7-year partnership, one that produced 6 Grand Slam titles, a world #1 ranking, and what Ferrero described as something he poured his heart and soul into, was ended by a document and a deadline. As of this week, Ferrero has been forced to release an official statement correcting fabricated quotes being published about him in the Italian press. He had to attach the original ATP transcript as evidence that his own words were being misrepresented. A man who gave 7 years to building someone else's legacy is now spending his time defending the accuracy of his own statements. Meanwhile, the father who drove the decision that made all of this necessary has still not offered a single sentence of substantive explanation. That is not restraint. That is the silence of someone who knows exactly what the contract said and exactly what it meant. If you want to understand why this story matters beyond the tennis, Why the tennis world reacted with such force when the details emerged, it comes down to something that has nothing to do with coaching contracts or non-sporting clauses. It comes down to what it means to treat a person as a person rather than as a resource. Ferrero was named ATP Coach of the Year 6 days before the split was announced. He had already planned the preseason. He was given 48 hours and a Monday deadline. That is what Alcaraz's father decided the man was worth. That is the demand Ferrero finally exposes. Not with rage, not with bitterness, but with 6 months of careful, documented, sourced interviews that have painted the full picture for anyone willing to look at it honestly. And if you are watching Alcaraz win titles in 2026, and he is winning them brilliantly, relentlessly, understand that the foundation beneath those titles was built by a man who is no longer allowed to watch from the box. If this video gave you something, a perspective you had not seen laid out this way before, hit the like button and subscribe. We cover the stories that go deeper than the scoreboard, and this one is far from finished. Drop your take in the comments, we read them, and we will see you in the next one.